Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Politics from the Penn Political Review at the University of Pennsylvania, a podcast where we bring experts on various topics to talk about current events. This is our first episode of Let's Talk Politics on the Road, where we interview someone who's not of the Penn community. We're here with Professor Eric Rauchway, who's a professor of history at UC Davis, who has expertise on U.S. policy, social, and economic history from the Civil War through the Second World War. Professor Rauchway's recent research focuses on the New Deal and the Second World War, with his most recent book titled Winter War, Hoover, Roosevelt, and the First Clash over the New Deal. Did I miss anything?
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. So the first question I want to ask is, in the wake of the 2020 election, it obviously seems like our country is still very divided and still very polarized. And I was wondering if you could say what you think are some historical precedents right now for our current level of social division.
Well, the United States has always had deep divisions between parts of the country, and it's possible to look at a map and see something that looks a lot like the late 19th century in terms of the sort of allegiance between the mountain states and the Southeast. And by contrast, the Northeast and the West Coast, you would have seen similar patterns to that in the late 19th and early 20th century, although I think the cultural valence would have been the other direction than it is today. And I suppose we could talk about that if you want. I think that maybe more germanely to the way things are at the current moment is that for the Republican Party beginning in the middle 1960s, the project, if you wanted to win the presidency, was to break up the New Deal coalition, right? But since 1932, the Democrats had enjoyed congressional and presidential majorities fairly easily with this massive block or sets of blocks of voters that Franklin Roosevelt had put together and that had remained together through the Truman era. Not, of course, for Eisenhower, but certainly congressionally they remained together. And the Nixon administration and the Nixon campaigns had strategies of deliberate polarization, as Chuck Buchanan famously or infamously said, if we break the country in half, we'll have the larger half. And despite his sort of tenuous grasp of arithmetic, that was basically the policy, was to break up the New Deal coalition and pull off certain people, particularly the white working class and the white South, and bring them into the Republican Party. And so that's, I think, the beginning of the patterns of voting that we still see today.
So you mentioned the New Deal, and your most recent book focuses on the presidential transition, which I think is kind of forgotten between Hoover and Roosevelt. And so I think that holds a very important precedent for today. So I want to start with, why did you focus on the transition between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 to 33?
Well, as often happens when scholars light on an idea for a new project, the inspiration was a sense that people had this story all wrong. And I think that in this case, I had done some extensive primary source research for my previous book about Roosevelt's monetary policy and earlier and associated work. And in those projects, I'd come across lots of documents relating to this transition. And as I say, I came to the conclusion that the way it was generally narrated in both popular discourse and in the literature was incorrect. It was incorrect for an obvious reason, which is to say that Herbert Hoover lived for 32 years after the 1932 election and wrote extensive memoirs and spent a lot of time, not to put too fine a point on it, not telling the truth about what had occurred during this transition, as people who are familiar with the Hoover Presidential Library archives will tell you. So I thought it would be useful to kind of tell the truth about this period, and to point out that the Hoover narrative, which is Hoover's story, was basically, I offered to cooperate repeatedly with Franklin Roosevelt and he turned me down, and this was just terrible because Franklin Roosevelt was trying to see the economy crash before he took office, is essentially in all respects not only not true, but the opposite of the truth, that Hoover didn't offer to cooperate until perhaps the very, very last minute. And in fact, used the period of the transition to try to strangle the New Deal in its cradle, to try to, first of all, to veto New Deal style measures that were being put through the lame duck Congress, and second of all, to try to box Roosevelt in to prevent him from executing on the promises that he had made on the campaign trail. So that's what I wanted to talk about. In pursuit of that, I had to also sort of overturn another myth of the literature, which is that Roosevelt was very vague on the campaign trail. That is not true either. If you look, merely at the speeches that Roosevelt gave, you can see quite clearly what he said the New Deal was going to be, and it includes things like massive public works and unemployment insurance and contributor-funded old age insurance and worker regulations and support for agricultural commodity prices and um, basically everything that we think of as the New Deal was something that Roosevelt had put forward on the stump. So he felt that he had made these promises, and that at a time when democracy was under threat in the United States and around the world, he thought it was very important to keep those promises. So
I
the
see.
transition was a vital period where Roosevelt was trying to hold on to the agenda on which he'd been elected, and Hoover was trying to prevent him from carrying it out.
You're not only very emphatic in your scholarship, but also on social media. Um, so one thing I want to say is you had talked about like the opposition Hoover had to Roosevelt carrying out his agenda. Could you talk about kind of the roots of why Hoover took the path that he did?
Well, I think that Herbert Hoover had two reasons, one of which is sort of more entertaining than the other. The less entertaining, but probably more important one, is that Herbert Hoover was ideologically, or if you prefer, on principle, opposed to the New Deal. He believed that public involvement in the economy on behalf of workers was catastrophic. He wanted it not to happen, and he opposed it during his own administration, and he hoped very much that Roosevelt wouldn't see it through. I mean, even before the 1932 election, you could see Herbert Hoover being quite vehement about the problems that New Deal style legislation would was. You can see that in, for example, his veto of the Muscle Shoals bill that George Norris, the liberal Republican, saw put through to retain public ownership and operation of the dam at Muscle Shoals in the Tennessee River. That's going to be the cornerstone of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. When Hoover vetoes that, he says, look, this public ownership and operation of, in this case, a hydroelectric dam is contrary to American principles, the ideas upon which American civilization was founded. And that's why I'm vetoing it, and I will vigorously oppose measures like this. He's very consistent on that. He's what we would nowadays call a conservative. In the very modern sense, he doesn't think there ought to be public ownership of the means of production of electricity. He doesn't think there ought to be public aid to the unemployed, and he thinks these things are at odds with some version of American civilization that he has in mind. And that's the sort of the not very interesting but important reason that Herbert Hoover opposes the New Deal. The more interesting reason, which I think is less important, but people do like to focus on it, is that Hoover felt that it was sort of a personal affront that he lost the 1932 election, that with his years of business and government service, people should have allowed him to go on managing the economy, and that good things would have come their way. And so there's certainly an element of a sort of psychic wound that he felt as a result of the election loss. But I think that even before that, he's very vehemently opposed to anything like the New Deal.
And what kind of forms did Hoover's kind of intransigence take? What form did Hoover's intransigence take in that transition?
Well, it depends what you think the alternative was. You have to remember that this is a period when the Great Depression has reached its worst. So unemployment is creeping up in the vicinity of 25%, might not quite be there. Maybe it's 23 or so percent, maybe it's 22 and a half, something like that. It depends which figures you look at, but let's just for the sake of a rough argument, say it's 1 in 4 people. And many of those unemployed people have been unemployed for a long time. So that you have the deleterious effects of prolonged unemployment. Many people who are employed have insufficient employment, have part-time employment, so are unable to support themselves and their families in the way that they ought to. So you have this sort of catastrophic level of unemployment. At the same time, you have absolutely crippling deflation, where prices have fallen and fallen and fallen for nearly 4 steady years. And in particular, agricultural commodity prices are so low that many farmers are making the decision not even to bother to harvest their crops because it's not worth the expense that it will take to get them out of the fields and to the market. So they just leave them to rot in the fields. So you have this sort of agricultural plenty that's rotting in the fields at the same time as people are starving in American cities, and everything is broken, right? All of the institutions have failed, the charitable and what minimal public safety net there is. And Roosevelt has run on massive government intervention to counteract this catastrophe, and Hoover has run on absolutely the opposite, on maybe raising the tariff and continuing otherwise the policies that he supported, during his presidency, which is to not intervene. Those macroeconomic difficulties are compounded by a wave of bank failures. This is an era before there's deposit insurance or an activist Federal Reserve to backstop American banks. And there have been a number of these over the course of Hoover's presidency. And another one begins in late 1932 and continues into 1933. So people lose confidence in their banks. They take money out of the banks. They're losing confidence in the dollar. They're taking their paper dollars to the Federal Reserve banks and taking gold out because at that point, the United States was on the gold standard and you could do that. And again, through the course of the 1932-33 transition, the question is, what should Hoover do? You might argue that because Roosevelt has been elected on the New Deal, if Hoover really wants to cooperate, he should ask Franklin Roosevelt, what can I do to help, if not carry out your agenda, then at least not stand in the way of your agenda or assure a smooth transition to your agenda? Hoover does not do those things, right? Instead, he sees that led by the Roosevelt administration, Democrats in Congress are looking to push through a farm relief bill that looks very much like what the ultimate Agricultural Adjustment Act will look like during the 100 days. And Hoover lets it be known that he'll veto that he views that again as contrary to the principles of American civilization. And he doesn't think it ought to go through. So he stands in the way of that. He tries to get Roosevelt to swear off the key elements of the New Deal, to say that there won't be any debt financed public works programs, that Roosevelt will remain on the gold standard, and in fact, that he will seek to balance the budget. As Hoover says privately, I realize this will mean abandoning 90% of the New Deal. And Roosevelt won't do that, but Hoover sort of carries out this drumbeat of trying to get Roosevelt to make what Hoover calls these three declarations, which are essential to the economy. Hoover refuses to do anything to stop the bank panics, despite advice from lawyers and from the Federal Reserve that he ought to and that he has the legal power to do so. And even once he realizes that Franklin Roosevelt is going to do this, the moment that Franklin Roosevelt has the powers of the presidency, Hoover won't do anything. I mean, it would have been, again, if it had been me sitting in Herbert Hoover's chair, I would have said, all right, well, I declare a bank holiday, to last until noon on March 4th. And that at least will sort of see me out of my presidency. And then it'll be up to Franklin Roosevelt to do what he thinks he needs to do. Hoover doesn't do that, right? He views it as his job to keep the banks open and to let them to continue to fail until, somehow this crisis has bottomed out and corrects itself. So that's a brief rundown. There's a lot more that I could tell you to do with just sort of petty stuff, but that's the big policy picture.
Now, our listeners at this point can probably already kind of infer some parallels between what happened then and what's happening now. And the reason I'm asking about this is because I was wondering what kind of do you see any similarities between that caustic transition and the kind of caustic transition we're seeing now between the Trump and Biden administrations?
Well, certainly some big superficial levels, you could say that there are some parallels. I mean, I was trying not to be heavy-handed and say that the nation was experiencing a pandemic of bank failures, but I could have explained that. I mean, so you had in that case in 1932, as you have today, a case where an incumbent president probably lost re-election because of his management or mismanagement, if you prefer, of a very clear crisis. That's the reason that those incumbents lost, as people lost faith in their ability to deal with those crises. In Hoover's case, the Great Depression; in Trump's case, the COVID pandemic. So You can say, therefore, as I said already, in 1932, that people voted for the New Deal as an alternative way of dealing with the Great Depression and had the right to see that experiment carried out. You could say today that that people voted for Biden's, proposals for managing the sort of twin public health and economic crises and have a right to see that carried out, and that therefore, it would be the obligation of the outgoing administration to ensure a smooth transition to the Biden administration. And also in 1932-33, the cost of not carrying out a smooth transition was, of course, continuation and deepening of the crisis, people losing their jobs and their savings, and in some cases, their lives. As I mentioned, this was a time of starvation. And you could say the same about today, that the cost of not carrying out a smooth transition is going to prolong the crisis in which we find ourselves, where we haven't got a grasp on the pandemic or on its sort of larger social and economic effects. And people are going to lose their lives because of that. And so they're both sort of costly failures to ensure a smooth transition of power. When I say that there's not a smooth transition of power right now, I mean, I'm referring, of course, not only to the sort of bureaucratic business of delaying, allowing the transition and the transition funds to go ahead and to acknowledge Biden as president-elect, but the broader effort to delegitimize the election and to plunge the nation into a sense of crisis about the machinery of its democracy, which I think is, going to, or stands to anyway, hamstring the incoming administration.
So you've touched on this. You've touched on this previously, but one of the things that, again, I think is underemphasized that you touch on a lot in your book is the role that the role that FDR saw the New Deal playing in restoring American democracy. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit here, given kind of the agitation in our populace right now.
Yeah, I think this is something that often gets overlooked in discussing the New Deal, as people think about it as a program for recovery from the Great Depression, and it certainly was. But that's only like the first half of the sentence, if you like, if you're thinking the way a New Dealer would think. It's a program for recovery from the Great Depression so that Americans will regain some of their faith in their political institutions, right? Because this is a time, 1932, when representative government, or democracy for shorthand, is in trouble right around the world. You see the rise of dictators and uh, particularly fascist movements that have been successful, particularly in Italy, and are about to be successful in Germany in rising to power. And it's based in part on this sort of loss of faith in the ability of liberal parliamentary institutions to handle a crisis on the scale of the post-World War I crises. And there's reason to worry that that kind of thing might happen in the United States. This is, don't forget, in the summer of 1932, you have the Bonus March coming to Washington, D.C. These are veterans of the Great War seeking to claim aid from Congress to relieve their unemployment. And rather than sort of deal diplomatically with them, Hoover runs them off with the army. And this is something that Roosevelt sees as creating the potential for a fascist uprising, because it appears that the government in Washington no longer cares about the ordinary citizen. So what Roosevelt wants to do, and what the New Dealers more generally want to do, is give people reason to have faith that democracy will work for them. That's the reason, in part, for the public works programs, not just to put money in people's pockets, but to put people into a more intimate relationship with the government as their employer, so that they can understand that it's doing something for them, not just for the bankers, not just for these sort of far distant institutions with which they have nothing, but for them. And Roosevelt explicitly says this, during the campaign and afterwards. So this is a time when democracy is in crisis in the United States and around the world, and the New Deal aims to restore it.
All right. I ask about that because do you believe we are in a similar situation now, where if the government does not respond to the demands of the citizenry, we will see a similar lack of faith in our current governmental structure?
Well, we've definitely seen an erosion of confidence in government to solve people's problems, right? If you look at the standard Gallup question, on that. The faith of the American respondents to those polls reaches a peak sometime during, the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and then sort of falls off because of Vietnam and Watergate, and recovers a little bit with Reagan's election, but then falls off again with Iran-Contra. And, despite some bumps upward, really does sort of remain in the dumps thereafter. So we've been in a sort of generational crisis of faith in our institutions that's been promoted by, the kinds of folks who want to tell you the government is the problem, not the solution. And you've heard that, I think, from representatives of both parties, as well as from various other sources in society. So I think we were already at a nadir in terms of confidence in government's ability to do constructive things. And I don't think that the last 4 years have helped. I mean, we've seen a government at Washington in, the years of the Trump administration that hasn't been able to do much for the average American, and has promised to do little and has done less, let's put it that way. And of course, has been especially inept in handling the current crisis. So yeah, I do think we're at a time of crisis in democracy, whether it's, precisely in parallel to that of 1932, 33, it's impossible for me to say. But when you have large shares of the electorate saying they don't have confidence in the election that just took place, even though, as far as I know, there is no solid evidence to suspect it. That's a real problem.
Given the level of polarization now, that I would assume is more hyper today than even than during the New Deal. Do you think that even like successful government intervention on part of the Biden administration would restore people's faith in the ability of government to do good?
Well, first of all, I should warn you that historians are notoriously bad about the future. We only do the past with any degree of competence, and not always that. But so that having been said, of course, I don't know. I think there's very little reason. I think, unfortunately, we don't have to worry about that. I think there's very little reason to expect an aggressive intervention on the scale of the New Deal out of a Biden administration and this Congress. So I think it's a moot point. Um, I fear, the headlines this morning were about Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying, well, we don't really need a bigger stimulus package, an aid package. And that's, unfortunately, I think we're going to hear a lot more of that sort of thing, that they're going to be dialing back expectations. And part of that will be because they can't do anything else as long as the Republicans retain control of the Senate. And part of that will be because the Democratic Party today is not the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, I think one of the last topics I want to touch on with you, and while it may seem more lighthearted, I think it's still very important, which is, as I said, like I think you are part of the rise of what people would call the Twitter historians. Uh, I mean, I'm like, and I want to ask you first, like, have you noticed yourself kind of this rise in prominence of people taking an active interest in not only history, but historians and social media?
Well, in a sort of very narrow sense, I think it's clear that there is an audience, a micro audience, if you like, of people on Twitter for the remarks of historians, both as they pertain to reflections on current events and as they pertain to, here is an interesting story from history that I thought I would tell you. And I imagine you're familiar. I know you're familiar with the phenomenon of Twitter threads, where historians will say, with greater or lesser degree of charisma, listen to me while I take you on a journey through the sources, and then attach a series of tweets with screenshots or links to documents and sort of tell a story about their area of expertise. And that gets a lot of engagement. This is one of the weird things about Twitter, and I assume of other social media, is you can look at the metrics. And even if people didn't like or retweet, you can see how often people engaged with something, that is to say, looked at it on their screen. And, there's obviously an audience for this sort of thing. I am as nothing, as I'm sure you know, with the likes of Kevin Cruz, whose follower count is at least 10 times what mine is. But there's still a couple of tens of thousands of people who follow my account, and I'm not sure I knew that there was an audience for that sort of thing. So there is, as you say, an audience for that sort of thing, whatever that sort of thing is. I think I don't do the same thing that Kevin does, and that's probably reflected in our respective follower counts, but he's better at it than I am. But there are certainly, there's certainly a kind of, if you could do a social network, and possibly somebody has done this, of the historian accounts that follow each other and who follows them, I think you would see a social network of people who are interested in that subject. Now, why? I don't know. It's a strange thing to me, but yes, it definitely exists.
My theory is that, and this is actually one part of the last question I might ask you, is that it's because that in recent history, I think people have seen a rise, or at least in greater prominence, of some what people consider false history, um, and that they've been looking for the correct historical narrative to counteract that. Do you see any truth to that? And like, what advice would you give to regular citizens about like how to discern good history from bad history?
Well, history's always been a discipline more open to non-professional practitioners than essentially any other that I know of, maybe even including literary criticism, right? History has always treated, um, at people outside the academy, people without PhDs, people who nevertheless do the research and the legwork as, colleagues. And that's unusual, if not unique, for the discipline. So it makes it more open, and that's one of the pleasures of being in it. It also sort of, as I think you kind of suggested here, makes it more vulnerable to bad faith actors. And there are certain people who are tendentious in their claims, to the extent of simply putting forth uh, false information. There are people who are highly selective in their use of sources. Um, and of course, there have always been such people in the academy as well as outside of it. I mean, it's not exclusive. But I think there has been kind of within the past several decades, a kind of rise of a certain species of person who wants to write about history without any regard for the canons of critical evaluation of evidence, and only just to make the points that they want to make. And usually these people do come from outside the academy, and quite often these people are trying to make present day political points. And I think that that's a real threat to again, sort of civic health in the United States, because folks don't necessarily know when they're being fed this kind of untruth. And you ask how to tell. I mean, it used to be a lot easier. It used to be that folks like that didn't have access to platforms that would bring them to the notice of the ordinary general reader. But now they do. There's been an increase in visibility of charlatans, and that's a real problem. How do you counteract that? The best solution I can offer you is not a brilliant one, I fear, but it is to read more widely and to exercise your own critical faculties. I mean, the reason history has long been open, as I say, to amateur practitioners, is that people can do what historians do if they can get about and look at the evidence and think carefully and critically about it, and to suspect one's own prejudices and prior beliefs, and to weigh evidence carefully and dispassionately. What I'm prescribing, of course, is entirely at odds with the Twitter temperament and age, but it is, I think, the only thing that can really counteract these kind of tendentious treatments of history.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.